Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on today's Net Zero Week webinar. It's fantastic to see so many of you coming in and being here. We're really excited about the program we've prepared for you today, and we have an outstanding panel of speakers lined up. Before we start, I briefly want to explain what Net Zero Week is and why we're holding this week of webinars. Net Zero Week is a whole week of webinars by each sector in the BSI Knowledge Solutions team. And over the week, we will be hosting a series of webinars across sectors, from the energy sector to transport and mobility, ESG, healthcare, digital and built environment, and the food sector. Today, we're not specifically focusing on a sector, but really on something that's become a bit of a flagship of our work, the BSI Net Zero Barometer. It's really our way of taking the pulse of UK businesses and understanding how leaders are thinking about net zero, what progress they're making, and where there are still barriers. And over the past few years, it has become one of our clearest windows into the reality behind the policy headlines. So let me briefly put net zero itself into context. When the UK became the first country in the world to legislate for net zero back in 2019, it set a global benchmark. But since then, the journey has been far from smooth. We've had a global pandemic, a number of lockdowns, I think it's 3, we had 5 prime ministers and 2 new monarchs. We've seen strategies launched, reviewed, revised, and sometimes rolled back. More recently, we've seen renewed and intense political debate, and one that makes net zero not just a climate issue, but an economic, social, and political dividing line. The new-ish Labour government has doubled down on decarbonisation, pledging to decarbonise our power grid by 95% by 2030, and to work with the private sector to double onshore wind, triple solar, and quadruple offshore wind by 2030. This is alongside major investments in hydrogen, marine energy, and carbon capture and storage. At the same time, Reform UK are now leading in the polls, and it has built its platform, amongst other things, on rejecting net zero targets and promoting more fossil fuel extractions. Globally, the picture is pretty much just as mixed. While some major economies are accelerating, others are pulling back or softening commitments. The Trump administration has formally withdrawn from the Paris Agreement for a second time and dismantled a range of climate and clean energy regulations. And SBTi has had to delist more than 200 corporations for failing to formalise near-term or net zero targets. On top of that, major asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard have significantly scaled back their net zero and ESG commitments. This is why measuring where we are really matters more than ever, because only with evidence can we hold ourselves accountable, maintain public trust, and build that into genuine net zero progress. It is for this reason that I started the Net Zero Barometer 5 years ago. The Net Zero Barometer, as mentioned, is our way of taking the pulse of UK businesses on their journey to net zero. Each year, we simply ask leaders across sectors where they stand, what targets they've set, and what actions they're taking, and also what challenges they face. It's not just a survey, it's a reality check. It shows us the trends, the pressure points, and the support businesses might require if we're going to turn ambition into delivery. It really helps us cut through the noise to show us how organizations are actually responding. And it's also a tool, a way for us to spot gaps and understand where we can focus our standards activity. And so I think it's important to know that net zero really isn't a niche policy. It's really one of the defining global socio-economic trends of our time. It touches nearly every sector and every business and all of our lives from now until at least 2050. But it's also one of the most contested. And in that tension between ambition and reality, between politics and practice, is where the Net Zero Barometer can really add value. So with that in mind, let us turn today to today's session, and we'll dig into the latest barometer and explore what it tells us about the state of net zero and where we are right now. Next slide, please. So we have an agenda for you here. We have about an hour and a half or so where we talk through the Net Zero Barometer. And in order to do so, we also have a panel session where we have some excellent panelists that will allow us to sort of talk through that. So let me go to the next slide. Let me introduce them. But before I do, I knew there was a different slide. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. To make you aware, this is a listen-only webinar. Microphones and cameras will remain off for attendees. You can submit your questions, and please do so via the Q&A button at the top of the screen. Questions will be addressed following the presentations, and for technical issues, please report them through the same question box. We will monitor the chat box, and we will provide any information there, so you can keep an eye out on that. We will also send out a feedback survey, and upon completion you can receive a link to this webinar recording. Please note that this is a CPD accredited webinar, so please complete the survey to request your certificate. You can also learn more about any up and coming events, particularly around Net Zero Week, on the QR code in the right. Next slide, please. So in order to have a good session, we've really established an excellent panel today. So let me introduce them. We've got Martin Baxter. Martin is the Deputy CEO of ICEP. Some of you might have known that under a previous name of IEMA. And ICEP is the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals. Martin works in the UK and internationally to accelerate the transition to a sustainable future and support people in the development of sustainability skills and green careers. Martin has national and international experience in developing and negotiating global and European environmental management standards, and in developing capacity for effective and widespread implementation. He also chairs the ISO Environmental Management Systems Committee, which is, for those in standards, ISO TC 207 SC1. Martin is a board member of ICEP and a non-executive director of the Society for the Environment and the Broadway Initiative. He's a visiting professor at Cranfield University and was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Derby. We've also got Tasha Leith with us, the interim head of Net Zero at BEMA. Tasha heads up the work on BEMA 2050 Connected, helping to support BEMA members and keep them informed of the latest news and changing requirements on their journey to net zero. Tasha had previously worked with a BEMA member company as a sustainability manager, and it is this knowledge of the complexities of decarbonising business and supply chain that brings invaluable experience to be shared with all members. We have Tia McGrath, who is policy advisor at CBI, and she has a background in law. At the CBI, she has worked closely with businesses to support the UK's energy transition, ensuring it is positioned as a strategic economic growth opportunity. Her recent portfolio has focused on delivering the infrastructure needed to enable this transition, including government engagement on grid connections, planning reform, and high energy costs. And finally, we've got Griffith Jones from the FSB. Griffith is a policy advisor at the Federation of Small Businesses, where the team aims to provide a voice for the UK's 5.5 million small businesses and the self-employed. He leads on the net zero energy and infrastructure policy portfolios. FSB publishes regular reports on a range of topics that affect small businesses, including FSB's quarterly confidence report and the recently published new growth report. And it provides an in-depth look at how net zero policy affects small businesses. Prior to joining FSB, Griffith worked in the policy at the Senedd in Wales at the Welsh Parliament. But before we head over to the panel discussion, let me talk you through who we are at BSI, a very brief overview, but more so talk you through our findings from the Net Zero Barometer. So let me just introduce who we are. We are BSI. We are the UK's national standards bodies, and in most countries they have one national standards body. We're the one for the UK. We are independent and apolitical, but we operate in the national interest, and with that we have an MOU with government. Interestingly, we are separate from government and separate from industry, and we're a not-for-profit, or as our chief exec likes to call it, a profit-for-purpose organisation. What that in reality means is that we generate a profit, and that profit goes back into the company. It doesn't go into external stakeholders or external shareholders. And that money then allows us to deliver on our purpose, which works on supporting industry with standards and standardization needs. All standards that we create are stakeholder-led, and all our standards go through a rigorous process which ensures consensus and consultation. And it's from this consensus and consultation that our standards get their legitimacy and reputation. All standards start out voluntary, but they can be referenced in regulation. Standards have the potential to deliver or support government policy, and I think particularly in where we are, standards play a key role in delivering policy outcomes, particularly when we look at net zero and the energy transition. To go from A to B, standards provide a real useful tool to support that transition. through the consensus and consultation process. That's how standards get their legitimacy and the reputations. All decisions that we make at BSI are in line and in this context. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, we are the UK's national standards body and we produce national standards, but we also represent the UK voice at international standards making. We are members of CEN, CENELEC and the IEC, ITU and ETSI, and most notably ISO. ISO is now, I think it's 164, I think it might be 170 countries, which provides the international infrastructure into standards making. So we are very much part of the international infrastructure in standards creation, and we represent the UK voice at industry, at those industry fora. Next slide, please. Before I conclude on our role as the national standards body and dive into the Net Zero Barometer, I probably want to just highlight what a standard is, because very often there's a little bit of confusion on what a standard is, and a standard could be a number of things. So just to be clear, a standard could be a specification which sets out detailed requirements to be satisfied by a product, material or process. A standard could also be a code of practice which gives recommendations for accepted good practice, which really brings together the results of practical experience and acquired knowledge from our expert. But standards could also provide a guide or be a guide which gives broad and general information about a subject and the background information where this is appropriate. Or it could be a test method which sets out a detailed procedure for performing an activity which you can then measure a product or test a product against. So it's very good to keep that in mind, particularly in some of the conversations today on the role that standards can play more broadly in the net zero transition. So I hope that's given you a whistle-stop tour of who we are as BSI and the role that standards can play. But I now want to sort of dive into the Net Zero Barometer. Next slide, please. So we're going to explore our Net Zero Barometer. I'm going to sort of talk you briefly through some of the key findings that we've got there. You can see the QR code there. If you scan the QR code, you can access the report directly. I think we also were going to do a poll question, so it'll be good to sort of launch the poll question now, if we can, David, at all, and ask you, the audience members, some questions. So the poll question for today, let me know if we have another one as well, is how confident are you that UK businesses are likely to get to net zero by 2050? It'll be very interesting to see how this one unfolds. I'm going to give it a little bit of time. Not in a month of Sundays. That is interesting. Okay, so let's give it some time, and I think we'll take this for our interest as well. So 3% thinks yes, 10% thinks it's likely, more than 40% it's 50-50, and another sort of 40%, 39% thinks it's a slim chance. So wow, that's 80% thinks it's 50% or less. Wow, that's pretty, you know, actually, and probably actually it's 88%. Ooh, that is really, really interesting. So let's move on to the Net Zero Barometer and survey findings. Can we restart the slide, please, and go to the slide that we were? Sorry, David, I can't see the slides. Can you head back onto the slides?
Hi, Seb. Apologies. We seem to be having some technical issues. Do you mind if you just pop yourself off camera while I try and stop the poll? Thank you.
Yep.
There we go.
All right, I can still see the poll. Are we Apologies, David, I can still see the poll and not the presentation. I'll give it 2 more minutes. All right. Can you? I can start talking to the presentation. Can you try and see if you? And please just cut me short. Can you try and see if you can resolve it and let me know where we are? I'll start talking about the barometer in light of the slide. There we are. Technical glitch that we've got. Here we are. So that works out well then. Okay, so let me set a little bit of context around what we're doing. The BSI Net Zero Barometer is in the 5th annual edition, and it's the flagship sustainability report, really looking at a snapshot of how businesses are progressing. And it was really started back in the day because I really wanted to make sure that we have a finger on the pulse, because I think it's very easy to be in an echo chamber, particularly if you're in a certain area, that what you hear is sort of what you think reality is. So that it was very important for me to make sure that we get out of our own head and really understand what's going on in the marketplace and how businesses are dealing with net zero. And so we wanted to have a representative set, which allowed us to be relatively confident of what we were hearing on the ground. So we built a survey and made sure that we had at least 1,000 senior business leaders across various sectors and business sizes ask and answer questions, and it really explores the evolving landscape of corporate climate action. We felt that 1,000 representatives was a good sample set to draw some conclusions from. Now we had our internal statisticians sort of help us with some of this work and ensure that the data was weighted against the Office for National Statistic data to ensure that any total figures reported are based on a nationally representative profile of UK businesses in terms of size. And we felt that that gave us enough confidence to understand what's going on and have at least some statistical viability with our questions. Next slide, please. So what did we find? We have a few slides of the key findings of our net zero barometer. And it's very interesting to see how things have changed and how things have changed relatively rapidly. So the big sort of overarching thing was that fewer organizations are setting targets to reach net zero, and only 1/3 of UK businesses today claim to have set themselves the target to achieve net zero. Now, where this is interesting is because we've asked these questions for 5 years, we can look back at what that meant against other years, and it is significantly lower this year compared than last year, when nearly 60% stated that they had done so. The other interesting element is that there is a divide, that large firms are more than twice as likely to have set a target than SMEs. We've also seen a slowdown in net zero action. Just under half of UK businesses this year claim to have either taken or are in the process of taking action. This is a big fall from last year, when the vast majority, 83%, said they had done so. Again, the trend is that the fall is more acute for businesses with fewer than 10 employees. So again, the smaller the business, the bigger the hurdle is, I suppose, in this sense. Barriers to action loom large. A very large percentage, 86% of UK companies claim to face ongoing barriers to actions, with the cost of action being the dominant factor, particularly for SMEs. And cost is one of those key drivers, and I think that's probably reflected in the economic headwinds that we are sort of facing. Next slide, please. So the sort of positive from our point of view is that we did see that the vast majority of UK businesses are interested in types of support, and particularly interested in practical guides and guidance. Obviously, from a standards point of view, that's really interesting, because we feel standards can do that, or can provide some support in that area. But also that the positive view that we had taken from this was that, well, we have a lot of businesses that are sort of saying that they are struggling with the cost, but that they are interested in support and doing something. So for us, that there was a sort of silver lining there. The other thing that was interesting was that consumers and consumer demand has emerged as one of the leading drivers for net zero actions. And we believe that this represents a big sort of business opportunity, because consumer demand if consumers can make the choice between, and particularly if there's equally priced between goods and services that are environmentally friendly, then that will be a big sort of driver there. Optimism levels are down. Over the last 12 months, we have seen that optimism has dropped from 76 to 60%, and only 19% are very optimistic, which is probably reflective of the poll question that we had as well, where we do see a drop in optimism. Commitments to net zero have also slipped. And while the majority continue to be committed to achieving net zero by 2050, only 25% remain very committed, while 40% are fairly committed. And confidence slips and strategies have been adjusted. I think this is a broader thing that we've seen in the economy. Only 50% are confident that their businesses will be taking net zero action over the next 12 months. Again, in contrast, this was 72% last year. And also a significant percentage of UK businesses are expecting to revise their net zero strategies and or targets in the coming year. So yeah, really interesting data points from our point of view there. Next slide, please. So from us, we can draw a few sort of conclusions, but we're very keen to sort of discuss this more broadly with the panel. But following a year of defined by uncertainty, our collective journey towards net zero has hit something of a little bit of a bump in the road. It is interesting because the longer term outlook now looks significantly more certain, I should say. I was with an executive councils with a number of chief execs, and we talked about the Labour 2030 target, and a couple of CEOs said, well, we always pushed for, we wanted to see more ambition in sort of politics, and we wanted longer term commitment. Well, we've got both now. We've got the ambition to decarbonize the power grid by 2030, that's very clear, and we've got long term strategies like the industrial strategy that's just been sort of launched. So we have both. Now it's sort of our turn to deliver, and so I think it's interesting to see that from that point of view, the longer term outlook looks much more certain in that sense. I believe there's a collective opportunity to embrace this sense of momentum and really sort of trying to turn that around into sort of action. And I think from us, the big sort of bright side, as I mentioned, is that 83% of UK businesses are interested in some type of support. So there is a collective desire to sort of do the right thing. And I think it's up to all of us. And when I look in the sort of corporate mirror, us as BSI, there is a role for us to focus our stance to make sure that they really support businesses. We are doing that in a number of areas with our Flex 30/30 standard and some of the other work that we're doing. But I think it's also making it more accessible and ensuring that that's accessible by businesses. I also think that if we get this right, we can help businesses and especially SMEs transition through this challenging period, but also see that actually net zero is not necessarily tomorrow's dream, but it's actually today's opportunity. Next slide, please. So for us, there were a few key takeaways and key sort of recommendations. Clarity and stability are very important, and we again believe that standards can provide some clarity in particularly what good looks like, and they can be powerful enablers to support innovations. And so we believe that they can be powerful tools for collaboration. Net zero is not a problem that anyone will address on their own. It's very much designed for or needs collaboration, and we feel that standards play a sort of key role in that. The other area that we sort of thought was that there's a two-way view to look at sort of net zero, but you can look at carbon reduction, but there's also actually the unlocking of savings, and there's an opportunity there to improve energy efficiency and cut waste and deliver immediate opportunities. But there's also the sort of more broader part is that we can see that the impacts of climate change on supply chains, and we can see that we have forest fires, floods, and those are sort of happening globally, and global supply chains are affected by that. So there's also a cost associated with that, and addressing net zero allows you to build more resilience into your operations. It also allows you to attract capital. So we believe that, there is a sort of bigger opportunity where you can save money and take the right business decisions that will also be in line with net zero, or that you can take the net zero decisions that are in line with prudent business decisions. Next slide, please. The other thing that we and that I've always sort of talked about is that I think net zero is a long-term journey, right? We're looking for 2050, so it's a daunting sort of task, and I think don't let good be the enemy of or perfect be the enemy of good. It's a long-term endeavor, and the finish line is set in 2050, and I think getting started is more important than achieving perfection right now. So looking at the transition in manageable chunks and actionable steps will be much better than, a good plan today is much better than a perfect plan tomorrow. So taking that first step is probably the most important thing. Collaboration will really accelerate progress. Collective action, like sharing best practices and case studies across sectors, will really accelerate that progress towards net zero. More transparency around what standards are being used, how they can help. It can foster greater alignment and hopefully faster adoption and more effective collaboration. We also think that there is a first mover advantage for businesses embracing net zero. We've seen the consumer demand, and we believe that as it is a longer term journey, the sooner you start, the more sort of first mover advantage you will have. So those are some of our key findings and key takeaways that we've taken from the Net Zero Barometer. But I am actually very keen on finding out what other organizations and people find from the Net Zero Barometer. So I think at this point, I'll stop talking, and I'm very keen to bring in our panelists. So can I ask, can we flick to the next slide? And can I ask all panelists to turn on their camera? I was wondering if we can start with some brief introductions and your reflections on what was presented just there. We've got a nice sort of slide here, which gives me a nice sort of order here. Martin, would I be able to ask you to provide an introduction to who you are, what you do, what your organization does, and any sort of reflections?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks, and great to see the feedback coming through in the census, and I think it's a really good opportunity to just reflect on where we are and where we're heading. So I'm Deputy Chief Exec at the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals. So we recently changed our name from IEMA. My role is a combination of external, both here in the UK and internationally. So I chair one of the groups in ISO, responsible for a wide range of environmental management standards. We're a UNFCCC and a Convention on Biological Diversity accredited observer. So we engage on a global scale in developing standards and transition to a cleaner, greener future. I also work with a wide range of our corporate partners as well, particularly on building up capacity and capability to deliver on this agenda. I think, first of all, in terms of the survey, I think it's no surprise to a certain extent, given the economic turbulence that we've seen over the last 9 months, which I think has been really significant. It's driven significant uncertainty on a global scale for businesses, and that's hampering investment, and therefore I think holds back some of the ambition. I'd probably say that I wouldn't see, so from our perspective, we're not seeing effectively half of organisations that had a net zero target stepping back from them. So I don't see people particularly dropping them, but the rate at which new organisations might be setting them, I think, is a difference. So I think that that's probably playing out. I think there's a little bit more reality within companies about what the nature of a transition actually looks like and what the heavy lifting might need to be. So the more that they've got through their understanding of net zero. It's pretty easy to set a target. It's once you get into delivery, then I think you start to understand actually what's involved, and therefore you have maybe a more realistic plan of what you know you can achieve today. What, if circumstances change, but the technologies are there, you will be able to deliver on. And then thirdly, what are the things that we just don't know how to deliver yet? I think those are becoming smaller and less significant, but equally some companies will be in that position. So I think having a more realistic view of their own transition is important. And then I would also say, you know, consumers being a main driver of action, I think is really important, because I think, you know, any organization that doesn't listen to its customers is not going to be around in business for that much longer. And so I think that's an important driver. And as we move, and maybe we get onto this in further because I don't want to hog things, once we start to see, you know, the 7th carbon budget and that coming into Parliament and the discussion and debate about what that transition looks like out to 2042 and where the, if you like, the heavy lifting that's going to be needed to get us to that point, then I think, you know, seeing how we take the public with us will be really important in that regard. So I think there's a lot to do. I think I'm more hopeful than the poll respondents overall. So I would say we are either yes, we will hit it, or we're very likely to. I think there's a big difference between net zero and absolute zero. So that's also something that just needs to be kind of reflected as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. No, really interesting there. Yeah, and yeah, really good summary of the consumer action as well, driving sort of a lot of business. Really well articulated there. Tia, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Seb, and thank you for the invite. Great to be here on this sunny morning. So yes, my name is Tia McGrath. I am a Net Zero Policy Advisor at the CBI. And the CBI collaborates closely with businesses across the economy to help understand and influence how the government can create the right conditions for investment in net zero and to support the green growth agenda. I work specifically on our clean energy transition, looking at some of the policy barriers and levers. For example, this looks at businesses around planning and infrastructure, which are critical to delivering the net zero transition. And I guess my thoughts on the barometer, they are sobering. However, like Martin, not surprised given the environment businesses are operating in, particularly with the impact of domestic events such as the last budget with the NIC increase, the rise in minimum wage, the impacts on the Employment Rights Bill, etc. So it increases the costs of doing business, which means organisations are having to think very carefully, even more so, about their investments, and against the backdrop of a shifting geopolitical landscape that you outlined earlier. So all of this combined, I can see why the sentiment around net zero has shifted. However, as you also outlined, there is a collective desire from businesses to achieve net zero. So it's ensuring that the government utilises this momentum while it's still then, it's important the government provides the environment to do so.
Brilliant, absolutely. Thank you very much. And it's really good to sort of put that in terms of the increased cost to do business. All of that will have a significant impact on this. Griffith, can I ask you to introduce yourself and the work that you do and what your organisation does?
Of course. Thank you very much for the invite, Seb, and thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Griffith Jones. I work for the Federation of Small Businesses as our policy lead in net zero energy and infrastructure. We're a member representative organisation of businesses all across the UK, all sectors and sizes of up to 250 employees. We have around 150,000 members. Essentially, our work at the FSB is broken into two halves: member services and policy advocacy. I work in the advocacy arm. We have offices in the devolved nations, but I work in the Westminster team and handle UK-wide policy. My role involves working with small businesses to understand the practical challenges they face around net zero energy costs, and conducting policy research through our regular small business index on a quarterly basis, as well as thematic surveys, including our recently released Net Zero survey. We use these sort of discussions with members and polling to discuss sort of policy, to develop recommendations and for government and stakeholders on how to help best support small business to grow and thrive, especially in the net zero perspective. With the barometer, with the other panelists, yeah, sobering but not shocking. We similarly conducted surveys conducting on net zero policy in the same area, and we're seeing the similar things. Rising costs in labour are really deprioritising net zero in a wider space. The high cost of energy following the energy price crisis has really maybe galvanised support around becoming more protective and efficient, but the drive isn't there at the moment. The cost barriers are high, and the policy convictions are not quite there at the moment. What we also saw, and we conducted our members, is that the lack of policy certainty provides a lot of uncertainty within the wider policy landscape. So if we think about things like the ZEV mandate, the change around those, really disincentivizing investment in things like EVs, because small businesses just aren't sure when that transition is meant to happen and what the regulation around those are. So as I mentioned before, sobering but not quite shocking.
Yes, thank you. And there seems to be, I wouldn't say a disproportion, but it seems to be a big impact on small businesses because of the sort of particularly the cost concerns that was sort of sketched out by both yourself and Tia. Yeah, really interesting. I'm sure we can sort of deep dive into that a little bit more. Tasha, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your role at BEMA and introduce BEMA and your sort of reflections, really?
Yeah, certainly. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having us on this webinar today. I feel like going last in the introductions, I'm likely to echo what my fellow panelists have said. Certainly the report was just a really good way to, I think, show us kind of the reality that maybe we're all feeling at the minute. Not surprising some of the outcomes that we've seen. But yes, so I'm head of Net Zero at BEMA, and we have a programme called BEMA 2050 Connected, and we are the UK Trade Association for Energy Infrastructure and Systems. So we represent a broad range of manufacturers across the energy sector, from power networks all the way to buildings and construction considerations. And within my role, I tend to focus on environmental policy, but also support our members with product data, best practice for low carbon manufacturing, and circularity principles within manufacturing. So we cover a broad range of topics. I think later in the webinar, we'll be reflecting a little bit on some of the key challenges. And within the work that we do at BEMA, we've already got a lot of active member companies working on some of the best ways to overcome these. But I think to sort of summarise thoughts or give some reflection on the barometer report as a whole, I think it's just a case of continuing to galvanise that action that we have seen. I think we're starting to see slightly that gap between smaller companies and larger corporations in terms of maturity and where they are. And I think the point around perfect being the enemy of good is probably something that we've all spoken about, I imagine, quite a lot within our roles. But that pressure now on SMEs is no longer to sort of deliver just a transition plan. It has to be a really robust transition plan. And particularly the criticism that we've seen on methodologies or mechanisms or offsetting, all of that within the public space has just sort of heightened that pressure. So I think that perfect being the enemy of good is a really important message that we should continue to echo and include within our conversations. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel discussion on the report.
Brilliant, thank you very much there, Tasha. I don't know if we sort of reflected on this already, but I think we talked broadly about sort of your reflections on the Net Zero Barometer. From your perspective, what does the state of the net zero transition more broadly look like now in the UK? Martin, I don't know if you sort of answered that in the sort of introduction already, but what do you feel the state of that transition looks like right now from a, I suppose, predominantly UK perspective?
Yeah, but I think from a UK perspective, the first thing to recognise is that we're more than halfway to net zero. So if you look at where we were in 1990 and where we are today, then we've done half the job. And we have a bigger economy at the same time. So we have started to break that link between, on the one hand, our economic activity and growing our economic activity, and at the same time reducing our impact on climate, and I think that's really important, and there's a UK leadership position to look at there. I think when I look at where we're heading and where the next shifts are going to be in order to get us through this journey, I think I'm pretty optimistic actually that we've got we know what we need to do and we know how to do it. So electrification is going to be a huge part of the shift that we're going to see in this transition. We've got a pretty good start in terms of generating cleaner power, and 2030 is ambitious for a clean power system. My sense is that it would be probably 2032, but it will happen. And so that I think is really important. And then there's a huge efficiency benefit from shifting to electrification of transport, mobility and heat. So that's a really strong position for us to be in. And then it's a case of what are the policies and incentives that need to be in place in order to take us on that transition. Recognizing that there are some challenges in some sectors or in some parts of the economy, particularly because of in some ways you have a greater capital cost. So the capital investment in order to deliver operational cost savings is how we need to be looking at this. And I think the engagement from the finance sector across the board and looking at what does financing the transition really look like. So the likes of the Green Financing Institute are doing a lot of work to support and provide insight into that. And certainly speaking to engaging with some of the banks, then we start to see some of the financial support that is becoming available to support organisations in this transition is there. So I think there are a range of things that are coming down the track. So we've seen what's been happening with electric vehicles. There's much more happening in terms of infrastructure to support charging, which is one of the potential kind of challenges if you want to kind of really roll that process out. There's a big choice for government to make, I think, on this, which I don't want to underestimate some of the political difficulties that there will be in some of these choices. So if you think about electric vehicles, we could have cheaper electric vehicles if we eliminated tariffs on imports from China. But then what does that do for UK manufacturing in the automotive sector? So that's so that's where government has to make its trade-offs. On the one hand, it could be cheaper for consumers. We can accelerate through the transition. The question is, where do you pick up the employment and the impact on communities which are dependent on those sectors? That's going to be a political choice. But we do know we do have the technologies to be able to go through this transition. We've got the Future Home Standard that is on its way, 2027. So new homes, 1.5 million homes is the government's target. We will then have that clear mandate around solar on roofs. The cheapest time to put solar on a roof is when you stick the roof on. So that's a no-brainer. So and that technology is the cheapest it's ever been and is available. So I think there are there is this continuation of the drive towards decarbonising our economy, and it's when you get to the end of this transition, so into the 2040s, when you're starting to look at what does it mean for agriculture, what does it mean potentially for engineered removals, where the really big challenges come. But by then we'll be well on the way, and we'll have greater insight into what are the new technologies, what's the innovation needed to deliver on that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really interesting. I think it's really interesting because that sounded more positive than I possibly would imagine. But it's really interesting how you put that sort of in context. And as you said, we're halfway there already. I think the 2030 target is such an interesting, ambitious target, really, but it will shape it. And I think my sort of background's energy, and that's sort of what I look at. And when I spoke to some of the people that are actively involved in it, they said even if we miss it by a couple of years, that's okay, right? Because the sort of general trajectory is there, and the more we electrify, the more we sort of reduce our emissions. So that is really, really interesting. And obviously the highlight of the capital investment here is going to be sort of obviously critical. Just looking virtually looking for eye contact around the table. Does anyone else have any perspectives on that? Tia, I can see you've unmuted. So do you want to come in there at all?
Yeah, no, happy to come in on that. No, I love the optimism, and I do agree to an extent. And I would maybe separate the political sentiment from the public sentiment. So I would say the political landscape on net zero has grown increasingly complex and contested, whilst the government, as Martin outlined, is intensified its clean energy agenda. We saw in the comprehensive spending review, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero receiving the most amount of public money for the spending review. So that just highlights how high it is on the government's agenda. And it's this rhetoric around supporting national security and economic growth. But I would say the cross-party political consensus is fragmenting, and this is in part being driven by the increased costs associated with the transition, which is putting pressure on the government's 2030 delivery timeline and the increasing geopolitical shifts away from decarbonisation. But as I said, there is a distinguishment between the public sentiment, which is important for business consumers. There was a recent study conducted by, I think it was Climate Outreach, which revealed that the public across the political spectrum feel positive and proud of the country's efforts to protect the environment and the transition to clean energy. But there is a cost of living is a real concern, with I think it was 74% of Brits believing climate policies will cost them money. So increasingly, I think net zero is hinging on this affordability question. I think policies that can help reinforce and neutralise this risk of other voices using increasing costs as a reason to rip up net zero. I think the government can, I guess, answer that question and counter the claims. Because when I speak to businesses, they would like the government to not be silent and ignore the claims around net zero, and actually rather than be louder and had these open and frank conversations.
Yes, I find the political rhetoric always really interesting in this space, and I've been sort of observing that sort of closely for some time now with sort of interest. The other thing that has always sort of slightly frustrated me, mainly on a personal level, is that we have often tried to sort of separate net zero and energy security, and obviously the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero sort of takes that a little bit, but I think we can make that sort of stronger, because we still have to import fossil fuels and all of that. So when we look at a cost thing, I think we always try to sort of have the either or, and I think we really need to build the case that net zero provides both, right? And yeah, the cost element is an important one there, but if we want to have energy security, net zero fits squarely into that. Griffith, I can see that you've got your mic unmuted.
I completely agree with Tia. I think there's a perception sort of within our membership that net zero is important. It's a priority for the majority of members within their own businesses, and about 2/3 of them said that it should be a high priority for government, in line with other sort of big priorities. I think it's really important to think about the past energy price crisis and how that impacted energy costs. They're still quite high in comparison as well, and that's really prevalent within small businesses. They're very conscious of the rising costs and the impact of things like volatile geopolitical occurrences impacting that in the future as well. So they need to sort of shield themselves from rising costs, and that's why there's a general sort of understanding and support for net zero by 2030. I think it's also important to remember that while there's a net zero maybe at a national scale, there's also things that businesses can do within their own operations, and that on that side of the coin we see a lot of sort of slower progress. So only 25% of our members believe that they could reach net zero by 2050. Information and communication sector was the highest in that, about 40%. But obviously the majority of their emissions come from things like electricity generation, electricity consumption, so things like Scope 2 emissions, which will come part of our sort of grid decarbonisation. And that varies massively between sector and region as well. So for example, Scotland and London, we saw the highest ability to sort of expect the transition to 2050, but in Wales, for example, it lagged slightly behind. So I think there's an issue with like knowledge sharing there, or knowledge from government in the wider sort of net zero landscape.
Yeah, the knowledge sharing is an interesting one, right? And I think it's also a challenge for us. There's a lot of good guidance that we have, but do we meet businesses where they are and where they visited? It's great to have it on the BSI website, right, it's better than nothing. So you know, we've got you know, a lot of free stands available, in particularly Flex 3030. I think maybe we can try and get a link in the chat to that, which is a free guide for net zero transitions, particularly focused on small and medium businesses, and it allows them to take that sort of first step. But I'm always aware that it's on the BSI website, and you have to kind of know the number. And you know, if we look at sort of SEO optimization and how many clicks, you know, I think you've lost a large proportion of the audience, or they have to be really dedicated to that. And I think that there's sort of effort here and there, but I think it's quite hard for an SME to know this is where I go for resources that can at least help me or take that first step, really. So I think that's probably something that, you know, as a national standards body, we can challenge ourselves on, but also really hopefully more broadly, something that we have to sort of all think about, to say, how do we get all of this good guidance, and not just from us, but, you know, into the hands of SMEs. Tasha, do you have any sort of thoughts on that? I appreciate that everyone's sort of unmuted.
No, yeah, certainly. I think, you know, I really echo Tia's comments. I think also just that reflection on kind of the stability that all the sectors are calling for from a policy point of view. I think whilst the current government are engaging with us and giving us that long-term policy view, I think that cross-party consensus and the change there is kind of lingering in the back of some of these conversations. You know, if you're expecting a big government change, that long-term stability isn't there, even if the policies, you know, do exist today. So I think it's trying to build the processes and the resources within business to bring back that resilience part of the conversation. I think Tia mentioned it earlier, you know, that stability and how that can bring those efficiency pieces in, as well as obviously the environmental and net zero benefits. I think there was a bit of divergence from trying to bring in those business benefits, probably initially when this net zero topic started within business. We were trying to maintain focus on carbon reductions, but I think now it's got to come more back into that holistic piece, not only from an internal mechanism perspective, you know, a sustainability manager trying to articulate, you know, a potential cost or a capex expenditure to the board. They've got to be able to do that in a well-rounded way that doesn't just consider the carbon impacts. It's got to show that the impacts of that long-term business and the prosperity of that investment. So I think, yeah, the points you've just made there on resources and tools, I think it's not just the resources and tools on necessarily how to do those actions or the steps you need to follow in a prescriptive manner, but also how do we communicate this topic, and how do we kind of communicate in a way where it can't be politicized as much, because we've really made a clear case for all aspects of it, that, you know, we're not just doing it from a net zero perspective. We've encompassed all those considerations, and still we're seeing that this is the right step forward, you know, for people in their homes, and obviously for businesses, and for that long-term economic growth that we're all, you know, supporting and trying to achieve.
That's a really interesting point, because I think for me there is, you know, I've been in sort of energy and sustainability for 20 odd years, and there has been some sort of, you know, back and forth on this, and I think sometimes we've, you know, we group things together, ESG and health and safety manager and that kind of thing, and I think since, I think it's COP26 and we're committing to net zero, that sort of completely separated. There was a big focus on sustainability. We obviously don't want that sort of moving back, but we do see that political sort of rhetoric sort of entering sort of business, and we have seen organizations drop the net zero pledges and all of that. To me, the more, I've always felt the more you can make it a business decision, right, the better it is, and the more you can integrate this into business as usual, so it becomes more of a finance decision. We know, you know, to Martin's point, there is consumer demand for this. We know there are sort of cost savings, so the more we can put that into sort of, for want of a better word, normal finance based decisions, and we have a clearer way of communicating that, the easier it is for organizations to make that a straightforward decision, rather than it being seen as doing something green. It's actually the right business decision as well as a sort of sustainability decision. Actually, Tasha, staying with you, you were talking earlier in your introduction that there are some barriers. What are some of the biggest barriers or the biggest barrier that you see for delivering net zero targets today, particularly with some of the businesses that you're working with?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few different ones you could pick, I think, but probably the biggest or the most common discussion points we get in from members trying to collate guidance or go back with best practice is just that data use and consistency, and try not to commit to anything where you're not entirely sure of the reporting or the standard or maybe what you could be aligning to. So I think it comes back to the point that's made within the report and that you made within your opening remarks, but it's that maturity gap, I think, between the larger corporations and the SMEs that now the large corporations that have maybe gone through all of those quick wins or low-hanging fruit, I think is a saying that's used quite often, but they've maybe done all that optimization within their scope 1 or their scope 2 emissions. So the standard that has been set for an SME starting out is now radically different to the standard that was for a large corporation maybe starting 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I think that coupled with that data consistency piece where they're trying to understand what is the right carbon coefficient to use, how do I make sure that the carbon coefficient I'm using or the measurements I'm using are comparable or consistent with those in the same sector, particularly where we're seeing analysis of maybe products being used as a specification thing. There's that worry or that fear of, well, I can do the calculation, but how do I know that this is consistent and comparable across the entire sector? And I think it's just really getting people to the point where they can have confidence in the data, and not necessarily confidence that they've got the perfect piece of data, because again, we're not saying that an SME needs to have activity supply chain provided data to start out at, but it's that confidence that, okay, I've used a spend-based methodology, but I've still followed a rigorous standard, and I still have gone through a clear process to arrive at that end point. So I think the barrier is probably a bit to the point that you made earlier, Seb. It's actually, how do we get this information to people at the right point in their journey so that they know where to go? Because I'm not entirely sure if I was an SME what I would be Googling to figure out where to start today. So I think it's just conversations like this, making sure that us as trade associations are providing that resource and guidance and signpost into standards like Flex 3030. I think it's just trying to bring that together and recognize that, yeah, there are bigger companies that are further along on their journey, and there are people that are still just starting out, but that there are routes that you can take to navigate that. And within the navigation of those routes, we can work with you to still try and put together that best practice or guidance where there is maybe a sector specific challenge that, okay, we can't overcome that today, but we as a trade association work with our members, and it's something we've done in the past on things like the use of embodied carbon to support that sectoral drive forward. So I think, I'm not sure if that's one answer that I've given you there, or about 5 sort of wrapped together, but yeah, if I was to come back to one big barrier, I think it's just that data consistency and the confidence in the data for people to feel that they're able to make that start. And yeah, I'll hand back to any of my panelists if they've got any others.
Yeah, no, that's sort of music to our ears from the point of view. Yes, we obviously need standards there and shared vocabulary and shared sort of data. It's also quite a hard problem to solve, and I think we've got to recognise as well that, and this is where I feel with a lot of things in life, I'm sort of in a central sort of position, right? I think it's important at the same time, let's not make we talked about perfect being the enemy of good. I think that also counts for standards, right? Like best practice will evolve. And I think there needs to be some recognition of that, if we have good practice now, that might evolve and standards might evolve as well. But I think that's better. And the other thing for me is that we should think, like I think Facebook years ago thought mobile first, right? I think we should start thinking digital first. If we look at standards, a lot of the time they are still sort of flat PDFs that you will have to sort of translate. And I think from a standards point of view, they will have to evolve to how can you make this as seamless as possible, particularly for SMEs, because when we think about the cost, if you haven't got the resources to do some of that work, then you don't do it, right? So the easier we can make it, even if it's recognized as not perfect, I think that's always a good sort of step to take. Griffith, you unmuted earlier. Did you want to come in?
I think that discussion around data is really, really interesting, because we've been working with organisations like Bankers for Net Zero through the UK Business Climate Hub on sort of discussing and standardising a voluntary sort of carbon accounting structure. Because what we found is that the majority of small businesses, for example, don't even know what the term Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions are. So when you're providing a PDF for them to fill out, and you're using that sort of terminology, that's already a barrier to access things like supply chain opportunities or procurement through PPN 0621. So we're working just to simplify that in a voluntary, and hopefully I think what we're seeing as well is that different businesses are getting different data requests from different sources. Those sources could be, and the sort of the link to that data can be weighted differently. So for example, Scope 3 might be more important to some organisations or for procurement opportunities, and then Scope 2 might be. So we're trying to answer that standardised process by stripping out all the technical jargon that's produced from a top-down perspective to make it as easily accessible for small businesses as possible. And I think that type of standard is hopefully what we'd be able to sort of implement on a wider economic basis then. So the minimum that small businesses need to do, they can provide about once a year, and they can reuse that when accessing things like supply chain. So when we're speaking to businesses, the majority of those requests are currently coming from tier 1 suppliers or big businesses who are also trying to access procurement opportunities. And about 10% of the members have already seen the inability to continue with the contract because they're not being able to provide all that data. But that won't be the same for another company they supply for. So the lack of consistency within the economy does sort of growth opportunities for small businesses, and that's something we're trying to rectify. Beyond that, just a general knowledge thing, not all small businesses are built the same. You know, a certain type of heat pump, for example, won't be applicable to a certain sector or a certain size. So we're working with organisations like the UK Business Climate Hub to sort of provide a central hub of SME related data that, again, strips out all the jargon, just provides practical steps you can take, examples of best practice or peer guidance we found really, really important with businesses. So what other businesses in the sector are doing, what the benefits of those are. And that hub is sort of fact checked by things like DesNet as well, which is really positive, because then we're aware that all the information there is correct. It's also got a list of things like grants and funding opportunities there. So just providing a limited small space for small businesses to get all that information in one go. And we're hoping to see that sort of linked to the newly launched Business Growth Service as well, which we think is at Federation of Small Business a fantastic sort of portal, because you just need to put your postcode in, your sector and your size, and it provides a lot of information on support for businesses. So an interaction between those sort of two hubs would be really, really great for our members.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think having a background in Green Deal, energy company obligation and all of that, the more you can centralize that information, and it used to be a bit of a patchwork, who's eligible for this, and then there's different sort of funding pots. The more you can sort of streamline some of that, it seems quite obvious now, but I remember it used to be a real big problem back in the day. And I think technologically we've come on so much more that you think it should be relatively easy to sort of particularly package some of that advice up to sort of businesses. Did anyone else want to come in on that at all, on the biggest barriers they've seen, Martin?
Yeah. Could I just come in just to echo really the collaborative nature of the work around the UK Business Climate Hub, and I put a link into our chat, which hopefully could be shared with people. The reason I think it's really important is that not only do you have the likes of FSB, CBI, ISEP, Make UK, Federation of Small Business, Food and Drink Federation, British Retail Consortium, so trade associations, but also you have some of the big players that have got a lot of SME customers. So you've got all the major banks, so you've got NatWest, you've got Lloyds, but you've also got the likes of BT, you've got Sage. So actually we've brought together a wide range of actors under the common purpose, which says, how do we make free information available that's easy to access, and you can have some certainty that that information is accurate, credible, reliable, and you can start to kind of move down that journey. And the simple reporting framework that's being developed for SMEs, so that there's only one way in which any SME should be asked for its greenhouse gas emissions related data, I think is really important, because then we can start to drive that through larger customers into their supply chains. So I think there's a lot of work that's happening there to really bring this to bear. And so the more that people can use that the better. We also see a lot of business intermediaries and advisors utilising that site as well. So it's not just the SMEs directly, but actually people who are going out and speaking to them. So I think there's a real ecosystem there, and that should be the single central point, which is supported by government.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really good sort of resource. So we'll share that in the chat. The other thing that we'll do is we'll put that, there's a follow-up email going out. So I think it'll be really useful to put these resources in that email so that attendees today can know where to go. And the Business Climate Hub is a really, really good resource. We've had some conversations as well with the support to support them. There's another question that I thought which you might want to sort of take up separately at some point. To me, there seems to be a role to say, actually, as you talked about the sort of standards that SMEs are developing, is there a way that we can then take that final product and then formalize it into a sort of formal standard that we can then sort of, because I think there's some
I think that's actually being done.
Yeah, okay,
so
brilliant.
I think it is on a standards trajectory, not just here in the UK, but speaking to the people who are leading on that, into ISO as well. Because of course SMEs also are part of international global supply chains, so it's really important that when we look to develop something here in the UK, it eases trade as much as possible on a global scale.
Yes, absolutely, and I think in some aspects, some areas or industries can move a bit faster, and then you know, there could be a complementary area where you say actually national standards bodies can then formalize that internationally, and we have the sort of broader agreement. Really interesting. We talked about economic pressures. Griffith, wondering if you have any views on the economic pressures, particularly things like inflation or the energy costs. How are they shaping the corporate appetite to invest in sustainability?
I think it's beyond just investing in sustainability, and it's investment in general. So when we've conducted our small business index quarter 2 2025, we saw that capital investment in general was down about 30% in comparison to Q1, just showing a wider sort of level of caution within the economy. And what we've seen with businesses now, with things like increasing labour costs, increase of general costs, supply chain costs, for example, importing and exporting trade costs as well, is that businesses tend to be prioritizing survival at the moment over transformation or changing business processes. And these are specifically in sectors, things like hospitality, retail and construction. I think on top of that, you know, there might be support out there, but understanding or awareness of that funding is actually very low. So for example, in the data we collected, only 4% of our businesses have accessed UK government schemes to support decarbonisation. And it's small things like the government's currently running a boiler upgrade scheme and a workplace charging scheme, and awareness of those policies are under 16% of our membership. And if you go into actual departmental data on those type of funds, access for non-domestic consumers is less than 1%. And I think this is a small thing government could change that would actually boost that. So for example, if you see any comms on the boiler upgrade scheme, there's no reference to non-domestic consumers, even though they're easily able to access that fund in the first place. In general, capital is the biggest barrier for small businesses. About 40% of our members said that that's the barrier to investment. Things like 28% said they're using personal savings to fund sustainable measures at the moment. So using actual money that they have personally, not even business funds or profits in that regard. Only 13% of our members also said that they had the appropriate finances. So obviously the wider sort of downturn in the economy is massively impacting sustainable investment in general. On top of that, and something I mentioned earlier, is the energy costs are still quite high after the energy price crisis. But at the same time, you know, we've spoken to members who made investments into energy efficiency, or specifically micro energy generation, and they've actually shielded themselves from costs. So we have a member who runs an aquatic zoo in North Wales. They did a big investment in solar panels just before the energy price crisis, and they genuinely believe that that investment in micro energy generation, the ability to produce that on site and utilising things like battery storage, meant that their business survived the energy price crisis. They were definitely shut down based on sort of wider changes. So the energy costs haven't fluctuated massively since then. Electricity costs are still quite high. We found that about 50% of our members said the cost of utility is the biggest driver of cost in general for their business, which is obviously going to impact investment in the long term.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's why I always think these sort of opportunities are where you can sort of look at sort of, we know energy costs are high, and energy efficiency savings do have that payoff. And again, you know, that's sort of bringing it back to sort of, you can hit both, you know, cost savings and do the right thing for net zero, right? And I think it's really interesting. Where do we start to get that sort of break-even point on some of these decisions? And I think with energy prices rising, that seems to be a no regrets move, right? And again, that there is some guidance out there. ISO 50005 is another freely available standard that government sponsored to sort of look at energy efficiency savings, particularly for SMEs, which probably brings me on to interesting areas. Like we talked about the challenges, the pressures, all of that. There's got to be opportunities here as well, and we talked about the sort of cost savings. Tia, wondering, what do you at the CBI, have you guys thought about some of the opportunities? Are there any opportunities that you see?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. I guess, yeah, in light of the fragmentation politically, it's good to kind of focus, especially for businesses. It can be quite daunting and confusing when you're reading these headlines. But I think just focusing on the numbers. So the UK's growth can be propelled by decarbonisation and the green economy. The CBI conducts a survey annually in collaboration with the ECIU, which illustrates what the net zero economy has already delivered and what its potential could be. So in 2024, the net zero economy grew by 10.1%, which was 3 times faster than the overall UK economy, and supported 951,000 full-time jobs, which is about 15% higher than the UK average. So it's more than just this economic potential. It's also digging into these opportunities that are UK specific. So the first one at a high level is this geographical advantage that the UK has, and it gives us a powerful edge. I mean, for example, we have one of the longest coastlines and shallow seabeds, which are perfect for large-scale wind farms, and the UK also has extensive offshore geological formations in the North Sea, which are perfect for the likes of CCUS technology. So this presents an opportunity to turn our natural advantages into global leadership and export potential in these technologies. And another area is the R&D capabilities of the UK. So we have these world-renowned universities that are leading in the breakthrough in the technologies like hydrogen, like carbon capture, like your battery storage. A number of examples is the University of Nottingham and Loughborough working on green hydrogen to help with power solutions for heavy industry, and the likes of Sheffield working with Rolls-Royce to develop SMR technology. So there's some standout examples of how UK universities are driving deployment of these low carbon technologies that are so critical to this transition. And then a kind of third opportunity area is the UK as a hub for global finance. So just last week, the Transition Finance Council came out with their guidelines, which are aimed at unlocking the capital needed for high emitting sectors. So this matters because the UK is setting itself as a global leader in transition finance and almost setting, I guess, a benchmark for what is credible transition finance, what it looks like, and positioning London as a strategic capital for climate aligned finance and attracting the global investors and reinforcing the UK's leadership. So in short, the UK is not just talking about net zero, but utilising the advantage as a global finance hub to build the financial architecture to make it happen and helping the finance flow to where it needs. So yeah, there are some real opportunities there, and it's making sure that we leverage those opportunities to continue on this pathway and to continue growing the net zero economy, as the report that we conducted earlier this year shows.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and particularly the R&D as you're talking is a major opportunity. Obviously, we've seen the state visit by the US president and the announcements around sort of investment in nuclear in particular, and obviously I wasn't expecting the answer to sort of go that way, but it's really interesting to say that actually we've got this sort of real both geographical and cultural sort of benefits here that we should sort of export, really, and particularly sort of SMRs is one of those where we say that there is a sort of big opportunity to provide a low carbon energy source there, and actually we can combine that with some of our expertise. There's a few audience questions that have come in, but I don't know if I can see them because I have got some sort of technical issues here. But there's one which is a little bit of a tricky one, so I don't know if anyone wants to sort of come in on that. But one of them that's come in saying, you say there's sort of commitment and consistency from government, but we've just heard about the Gatwick expansion in addition to Heathrow, and economic growth still seems to be trumping environmental concerns. Pun deliberately intended. I don't know who this is from. To what extent do you feel the government is truly consistent on this issue? So I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that sort of contentious question.
I'm happy to have a go. So, you know, we are going to have dependencies on fossil fuels for a period through this transition. That's pretty much unarguable. And the question is then, what's the transition away from that? And as you get towards that point, from what can we deliver in terms of absolute emissions reductions, and then where is it that we don't have that opportunity? How do you get beyond there? I think what's interesting is the SAF mandate that the government has brought in. So the requirement to have an increasing proportion of sustainable aviation fuels within the aviation sector overall is part of that transition, plus the investment in new technologies, which should be more efficient, but also changing kind of some of the power, the power basis for the aviation sector. And then, basically the government has got to stand up and say, at the end of this, the aviation sector will be X proportion of our carbon budget, and that's the bit that we're going to have to offset. If that's where they see it's absolutely critical for developing the growth, and the growth is going to be needed in order to fund other aspects of the transition, I suspect that that's how they make the argument. So sometimes it can look counter, and I accept that. But also, I mean, aviation's about 2% of global emissions. And yes, it will become a bigger proportion as other parts of our economic system, both here in the UK and globally, are on that decarbonisation journey. So some aspects are a really big challenge. But if you want the political will, then you have to continue to develop the economy, I suspect. And so government would argue that aviation is part of that mix, and also has to play a role in elements of decarbonisation as well.
And sorry, Tasha, over to you.
I was just going to say, I think supporting that answer, but also it's an interesting question, and I think the question is very sort of maybe telling of some of the challenges that sustainability professionals get quite often, that everything's a competing objective with an environmental concern, as opposed to recognizing the objective of growth, and how some deployments that may seem adverse initially to an environmental objective can also have supporting goals, and that, as Martin quite rightly says, that this will become part of our carbon budget that will be dealt with, but the deployment and the building of that will likely push us forward, and we'll have some learnings and some key takeaways. So I think it's just as well trying to not always see objectives or things that initially can be competing with environmental objectives as a blocker. And I think it comes back to that, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think I've always said that if the only objective of business was to be net zero, that's not necessarily an effective business opportunity. So you have to align and I think recognize the growth targets as well around some of these more difficult topics. And then it is important for us to engage in conversations around those, so that we can all take away learnings, and continuing the conversation, I think, is important. But yeah, it's a good question to have from the audience member.
And it shows the reality of the policy environment here, balancing growth versus net zero, and still having to deliver on green growth. And if you don't deliver on green growth, then the argument on net zero as a just cost becomes even sort of greater. So it is definitely a difficult sort of balancing line that the government has to take. Griff, there's looking at audience questions. I don't know if you can sort of answer this, but I'm going to sort of get this one. This is from Andy Brellisford. Griff mentioned companies' lack of understanding of scope 1, 2 and 3. When explained, scope 1 and 2 look pretty reasonable. However, scope 3 is incredibly complex as this involves their supply chains. How to quantify something that may not be in your direct control is problematic. This appears to be a blocker that prevents embedding carbon emission reporting and action to reduce. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I have many thoughts on it. We've conducted a lot of focus group with our members specifically on sort of carbon accounting or emissions related data collection. And yeah, scope 3 is almost nigh on impossible for members to collect. So for example, we spoke to a petrochemical logistics company a while ago, and they said that, you know, their supply chain stretches the globe, and they don't have the realistic power to phone up everyone in the supply chain to ask about their emissions related data. And a lot of these are bigger businesses as well. You know, the supply chain just goes smaller and smaller the further you go down. It's a mixture, it's a mixed picture. A lot of other countries don't necessarily collect data yet, so there's no ability to collect that whole picture data. But I think the important thing, as Tasha mentioned earlier, that averages are okay. You know, you don't have to be perfect. It's to get a fuller picture. And ideally, you know, we would have scope 3 being optional for small businesses at the moment, you know, as that sort of knowledge increases at a global sort of pace. But things like, you know, I think there are 15 categories within scope 3. Some of them are much more difficult to collect than others. Some of them will be around things like employee commuting, and realistically, maybe for a small business, that's actually a bit easier because there might be less employees within that sort of scope. But things like the emissions of your general supply chain are, yes, at the moment impossible for a lot of our members to collect.
Yes, no, and then the scope 3 question is always a sort of complex one, and again, it's probably a lot of sort of themes here, but you know, don't let sort of the perfect step in the way of sort of having good data now. Aware of time, and I've been getting a few sort of messages, so we've got about 5 minutes sort of left. I've got a couple more questions, but there's also a few questions in the chat. Probably want to ask, what do people see the role of standards in supporting this transition? And this is very much a selfish question for me to say, what should we be doing more of? What should we be doing less of? I think there's a strong case for standards, but very keen to sort of hear from the panel. But also, don't be polite. If you think there's anything that we should be doing differently as the national standards body, do let us know. So, Tia, shall I sort of go on there with you and then go around the table? Did you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking of an analogy for standards, I think I see of it as kind of like scaffolding. Like without them, the net zero transition can become quite fragmented, and implementing standards, you can, I guess, becomes more coordinated and cohesive. But I think there's a blended approach, like speaking to members who obviously are on the other end of standards. I think both voluntary and mandatory standards both have a role to play. I think the voluntary side of things in particular is just incentivizing those early movers. You know, businesses can signal leadership to their customers by, you know, going beyond compliance. But for policymakers, they can also serve as, I guess, testers to understand what works and how the market responds before making them mandatory. And on the mandatory standard side, I think it can essentially lock in progress and an accountability mechanism. So you're holding all participants in the market to account, ensures consistency in that sense. When you're needing to drive this transition, you need a carrot and stick approach here. But as a result, it helps with collecting data, reliable data to assess the risks and opportunities for investors in net zero. So I think there's benefits to both, but I think it's important that it's a blended approach. This is a transition. I think everyone on the panel has said, we're all learning from this transition. So I think the blended approach can create the most credible path to net zero.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much for that. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got closing to do, so I want to sort of look around the table to see if there's any other comments anyone wants to come in on that before I start sort of closing our session down. Did anyone have any other sort of comments or thoughts? Martin, I can see you've come in there.
Yeah, I think 2 comments. So firstly, standards are really important because they provide that underpinning trust around consistency and credibility in terms of approach, and they underpin global trade. So I think really important having that framework of standards. I do think there are too many standards. So I think the navigation and complexity of standards can be bewildering. So I think it's good to see ISO both having its net zero standard, which is under development, but also actually having an agreement and a partnership now with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to simplify that landscape as much as possible so that we don't have competing initiatives. So you asked what standards bodies can do. That simplification and removing either confusion or competing initiatives, I think, is really important.
Yes, and I completely agree. And my sort of quote or my sort of statement is less standards is actually better. Right? I think sometimes from a standards point of view, it's the sort of, you ask your barber if you need a haircut, right? Like if you ask the standards body, do we need a standard? I think there's often a focus of yes, we probably do. But actually, I think there is a question of what is the minimum amount of standards that we can have in this place. I think there's also, and I think that, with sort of AI coming on, how can these standards they often interweave, but actually how can we make that more easier to navigate? And I think we were sort of at that cusp where you think if you sort of start integrating AI and make that much more simplified, that could be much easier. But recognize that we're not there. Does anyone else have any sort of last comments or thoughts?
I'll keep it really, really brief because I'm conscious of the time, but I think there is a clear call from the business community that they want to support the net zero transition, and it's seen in your barometer that UK businesses believe in the importance of net zero, but confidence is waning under economic strain. But I think the message is clear. Continued policy clarity and financial support, infrastructure investment are needed to turn the commitments into delivery. But increasingly so, as I mentioned earlier, I think the net zero transition is really hinging on this affordability question. So if the government can successfully answer this exam question, I think the government can be on a stronger path to lead on the net zero transition. And sorry if you could hear a doorbell ringing, apologies.
No worries at all, and thank you very much for coming in there. That was really good. So I think we'll look to conclude it there then. Thank you so much for your time. I think that was really useful and really insightful. So first of all, I want to thank you, the panelists, for a great session today. That was really good. I certainly learned a lot. It's a shame we don't have more time because there's a lot more questions that I would love to ask, and there's quite a lot of audience questions which maybe we can address afterwards. I think you've all really outlined the scale of the challenge and the innovation that is required and how we get there. So thank you, and thank you for understanding the role that the Net Zero Barometer plays, and thank you for your comments on that. I also want to thank you, the audience, for a very good session today, and thank you for your participation and questions. Hopefully we can address some of those afterwards. We will follow up to all of you with an email containing a recording of today's sessions and the session with the link report. You do have to fill out the sort of survey to sort of get that. And probably the last thing for me to do is, next slide, please. Was there a slide with any other sort of webinars? Yes. So I'll be jumping straight onto the nuclear fusion and the role of standards later on today in about half an hour's time. But there's also these other webinars that you can see on nature markets, SME transition planning, and agri-tech. So we're going to go around this for the next week. So if you are interested, you can access them this week. Again, thank you all for your time. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.